Subjectively speaking, popular culture seems to be headed in a more positive direction as it concerns the image and portrayal of Afro-descended people. At the very least, there is more attention given to the needs and concerns of Afro-descended people. For some, this shift in how Afro-descended people are portrayed may feel like a modern phenomenon. But what if I told you that the image and portrayal of African people has always gone back and forth between positive and negative since ancient times, and that these shifts weren't necessarily motivated by any moral imperatives, but simple occurrences in history? What up, African world? It's Homesteam here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and contributing to this content. On Patreon, you can find more in-depth courses on African history. The link to Patreon is in the description box below. To begin, this video will be centered and analyzed from the perspective of the Western world and the Western intellectual tradition. There are people of African descent all over the world with unique histories, but this video is not equipped to document or examine those historical nuances. Also, although I'll be presenting information from books and peer-reviewed material, some of the data is still open to interpretation. Thus, this video will be my analysis of that information. I'm hoping that at the very least, I'll be able to give us a foundation to which we can launch our ideas. Please keep this context in mind. I'm really looking forward to what you guys may add or take away from this video. That being said, let's start with my interpretation of the historical data. My analysis is that the image and portrayal of African people since ancient times has danced between positive, neutral, and negative ideologies. The motivation for this dance was not inspired by any moral imperative, but simply historical events, and that's what we'll be discussing. So let's begin. The first well-documented perception of African people outside of the African continent no doubt came from ancient Greece. Based on the evidence, the Greeks seem to have advanced more positive and neutral attributes toward African people over negative. They even included African people in their mythology, advancing images of a pious and just Ethiopian, as they would call them. So what were some of the negative traits associated with African people according to a Greek perspective? Frank Snowden's comments on this topic in particular is a really good distillation of an ancient Greek worldview. His claim is that the negative portrayals of African people present in the literature is largely attributed to the Greek environmental explanation of human diversity. Some Ethiopians were described as wise and just, and Acharsis, a Scythian prince, gained a reputation for his wisdom. Yet some Scythians and Ethiopians, like other peoples who lived at the outer extremities of the earth, were reported to follow a primitive way of life. The wild habits of these Scythians and Ethiopians were explained not by color, but by climate, excessive cold in one instance and torrid heat in the other. In fact, according to Strabo, it was white people, not black, who were said to be the most savage in the world. More savage than the Britons were the inhabitants of ancient Ireland. Some of the other negative traits associated with Ethiopian or African people by the Greco-Roman world was the idea that Africans were cowardly, but this idea of cowardice was also attributed to excessively fair people, aka some Northern Europeans. The Greeks and Romans, like all ancient people, had their prejudice, but this prejudice wasn't based on race or color. At its core, this Greco-Roman ideology seems to have promoted the idea that the farther away you were from the Mediterranean, the more backwards or primitive you would be. This applied to Africans in the Deep South and to Northern Europeans. The absence of color prejudice in the Greco-Roman world has been noted by numerous classicists, anthropologists, and sociologists. So based on this evidence from the get-go, there was nothing binding Africans to negative moral traits based on skin color or overall phenotype. Reflexively, views of African people were either geared more in the positive or neutral direction in the Greco-Roman world. So when did the pendulum of perception begin to sway for African people in the direction of a more negative disposition? That dynamic shift seems to have occurred during the Moorish invasion of Europe. Many people aren't aware of the fact that Africans, specifically those originating below the Sahara, participated in the conquest and pacification of Spain. In fact, according to one source, the initial invasion of Spain by the Moors was spearheaded by the black troops of Tariq in 711. When Tariq crossed the sea, he came out at the mountain named after him and sent forward the Sudan to make war. When the Goths saw these frightful forms, they were terrified. The Sudan used to take Gothic and Christian prisoners and slaughter them and show that they were going to eat them. This increased their fear and terror. Now, the threat of cannibalism may have been an exaggeration, but I think the fact that the local people were terrified can be accepted. Conscripted black troops participated in the Moorish invasion of southern Europe in every wave of Moorish rule. In other words, the most memorable and perhaps significant introduction to African people for the average European was in the form of a conqueror. As you can imagine, this was not exactly the best start. Due to this history, we should not at all be surprised to witness a more censorious view of African people developing. In the earlier Middle Ages, black-skinned people were often characterized as evil in text and image, but by the 12th century, a more positive view began to gain ground. The characterization of the evil African in the early Middle Ages, aka during the Moorish era, is in stark contrast to the earlier Greco-Roman view, often portraying the African as pious, just, and at times even wise. However, beginning about the 12th century, after the Moorish panic had settled, the portrayal and image of African people took another shift. As the Normans took control over Moorish Sicily, Africans participated in nearly all levels of society. These roles consisted of positions such as retainers for rulers, guardians of royal treasuries, musicians, and even chamberlains. Johannes Maurus was one of these African people in Europe who attained a position of considerable responsibility at the imperial court, eventually becoming the Grand Chamberlain of the Kingdom of Sicily. Periodically, Africans were championed and celebrated in statue and paintings. A work discovered in 1954 in Italy shows a dignified African portrayal. One scholar proclaims that the sculpture is not a representation of a servant, but a dignified individual. Saint Maurice, a Roman soldier from Egypt, a highly celebrated figure, was portrayed multiple times as an African. Blackheads began to appear in coats of arms after 1250. Royal Aragonese examples are among the earliest. On seals, the Kingdom of Aragon itself was represented by 4 black heads, and the Aragonese provinces of Corsica and Sardinia were given other versions of the same coat of arms. Shockingly, just after the Moorish terror, if you will, the image and portrayal of the African transitioned into a golden era of sorts. Access to otherness and the old Moorish system seems to have been a trend in Europe during that time. Having Africans in your court as retainers was a symbol of your wealth and a projection of your power. This trend may explain why the so-called blackheads would be used to represent the highest levels of European statehood. However, it seems that in the 16th century, it was time for the routine shift. The portrayal of African people, men in particular, took a turn for the worst. So what was the motivation this time? Well, in the 16th century, the discovery of the New World had already taken place, and the need for slave labor increased. Enslaved Africans filled that role. With the combination of superior weaponry, freedom from the Muslim threat, and the acquisition of enslaved people, the idea of European or white superiority began to take form. With this historical shift, the need to justify slavery in combination with their ideas of superiority negatively impacted the portrayal and perception of African people. Europe's sense of superiority has its roots in the 1500s. Europe, at the start of the 16th century, was finally free of the threat of Islam. its main religious, political, and commercial rival. At the same time, European technology began to surpass what other civilizations offered and allowed it to expand its commercial interests far beyond its borders. By that time, the exploration and exploitation of the Americas and the West African coasts were well underway. The superiority of European technology, especially its firearms, over traditional societies, led to a belief in the superiority of European peoples over all others. I want to give you guys a brief outline of what we discussed. To sum it up, in ancient times, the image of African people was more often portrayed either in a positive or neutral light. Then, in the early Middle Ages around the Moorish invasion, the view of African people took its first shift from a more positive or neutral to more negative. After the early Middle Ages, there was a period of romanticization. Africans, in a similar vein to Greco-Roman times, were included more often in sculpture and painting, and their humanity was shown in a fuller scope, usually in a more dignified position. Their roles in non-African societies were very diverse, from the highest to the lowest, all these factors leading to a more positive disposition. Then, during the Atlantic slave trade, we see yet another shift back into the negative for rather obvious reasons. I think identifying this trend is a good thing for the diaspora because it puts things in context. Old tropes advance the idea that African people were always the same throughout the ages as it concerns their image or role, but this couldn't be further from the truth. From the evidence, the view of African people has been a steady development over time. It's ebbed and flowed naturally through positive, negative, and neutral lenses. These lenses seemingly having been impacted by the events of history and not some moral stimuli. Well, I'm all out, guys. I'm interested in hearing your analysis of these historical shifts. Be sure to leave your thoughts below. If you like these videos and want to support its continued development, consider supporting the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.